I'd like to welcome you today to Great Lakes Water Issues panel discussion, sponsored by Grand Rapids Community College and by the Grand Rapids Community College Sustainability Council. This has been put together primarily by Mary Ann Lessert, and I'd like to thank her for all of her work in bringing everyone together. Appreciate that. Here's what the format will look like today. We will, after a brief introduction from me, we're going to ask each member of the panel to do a 3 to 5 minute short, set the stage kind of statement about what they think is really important, the burning issues, the things that really need to be raised for our discussion today. After that's done, then we're going to let the panel do a little bit of interaction between them, talking back and forth about what they know and what they think needs to be discussed. After that discussion, perhaps occasionally prompted by me, at about 1:15, we're going to cut off the general discussion and open it up for questions from the audience. And that discussion can go on as long as there are questions, as long as people have something that they would like to have answered. I would like to mention for the students in the audience, if you do need to leave at 1 o'clock when your class would normally be over, if you have another class, need to be moving on, please feel free to do that. No one will stop you at the door or anything. It's just a part of the natural process of things. So welcome today. I'm glad you're here. And I'm really excited about hearing what our panel of experts has to tell us about water and water issues. Our panelists today include Peter Anin, who is an environmental journalist and author of the Great Lakes Water Wars, which, if you feel so moved, is available outside after the session. He's Associate Director of the Institutes for Journalism and Natural Resources. Also today we have on the panel Dr. Howard W. Reeves, who is a research hydrologist, the USGS Michigan Water Science Center in Lansing. We also have Christy Klump, who is Water Quality Programs Manager for West Michigan Environmental Action Council, and Dr. Alan D. Steinman, who is Director of the Annan Water Resources Institute for Grand Valley State University. Welcome, everyone. Appreciate your being here today. And I would like to now throw it open for the general introductions. We'll start with Peter.
Okay, great. Thanks, Gary, and thanks, Mary Ann, for organizing this. Can everybody hear me okay in the back there? So I'm just going to highlight some of the, I think, key issues here for discussion this morning. I always point out, and I want to point out again today, that I'm not a scientist. I'm just a dumb journalist up here. So defer for all the technical and the real answers to the scientists that are up here today. But I did write a book about the Great Lakes water diversion issue and the Great Lakes Water Compact. Really a remarkable year as far as Great Lakes water management is concerned, because to the surprise of many, this year the Great Lakes Compact was adopted, was signed by President Bush on October 3rd. A really important, momentous year in Great Lakes water diversion and water management policy. I don't think the water diversion issue is going to go away. Just because the compact has been adopted, as I mentioned last night, there's been a backlog of communities, particularly in southeastern Wisconsin, that are on declining or naturally contaminated or both groundwater supplies that have been waiting for the compact to be adopted so that they can apply for Great Lakes water under the limited exceptions clauses, and we can talk about that more if you're so inclined during the Q&A. But now that the compact has been adopted, I do think that the water diversion issue is going to sort of die down a little bit, and that we're going to see more and more attention in the Great Lakes region devoted to, from a policy perspective, to exotic species introductions in the Great Lakes, and particularly ballast water introductions of exotic species. So I think there'll be renewed pressure on Capitol Hill to implement legislation to control ballast water, and also similar legislation in Canada And so I think in coming months and years, you're going to see more and more on that. And sort of from a bigger picture, 30,000 feet down, I think the big issue, in a frustrating way, for the Great Lakes, looking long term, is going to be climate change and the impact that has on weather patterns here in this region, as well as water levels. And what will be frustrating is that, unlike, say, ballast water and exotic species introductions, it'll be harder to legislate our way out of the climate change situation here regionally, which is something that we can do in many regards regarding exotic species introductions. So I don't know if that's 3 minutes or 5 minutes, but those are my headlines. So.
I'm not keeping track.
Yeah, so I'll leave it at that for now.
Thank you.
Well, thanks for inviting me today. It's a pleasure to have a chance to be part of this panel. As the introduction said, I work for the U.S. Geological Survey, and we're a federal science agency. So instead of saying what I think the big issues are, I'll kind of say what the survey does. We have a pretty broad scope of things that we study: biology, geography, geology, geospatial mapping, and I'm in the water discipline. Most states have a water office in their state. Some of the smaller states are combined, like Vermont, New Hampshire, but Michigan has a water office. Our main office is in Lansing, but we have field offices in Grayling and Escanaba. And what the water part of the USGS does, part of our mission is the collection of data, unbiased data collected in standard methods. The methods are published, so if there's a question for, how is this data collected in Wisconsin, you could go to our books, or you can go online and say, these are the methods that are used to collect water quality data, water level data, both groundwater and surface water. And we also compile water use data working with the state. We don't do the surveys. The state does the surveys on water use, and we compile them into national synthesis reports on water use. So our mission as an agency is to provide this unbiased, multidisciplinary data to people for people to make better decisions. And in the Great Lakes, we've been working on a lot of things in addition to data. A Great Lakes-wide water availability and use program for the last 5 years. I've been a project chief on that. And what we're trying to quantify is get our hands around how much water is in the Great Lakes system, how much water is in the groundwater system, where are the groundwater divides, why might a groundwater divide move? In southeast Wisconsin, that became a big issue. How much recharge is there? Where does the recharge come from? And how much water use is there? To set the context for further discussions then on issues like the compact and implementation language within each state for the compact. We have a pretty large beach health initiative that's just starting that the survey is part of with other agencies. Invasive endangered species, that Peter just mentioned. We have scientists in the biological research discipline that study invasive species, endangered species. I put some bunch of reports in that table out there just so you can see the broad range of things that people are looking at. We have people looking at energy issues and doing energy inventories for Michigan. Michigan's a large energy producer. So people want to know, well, how much oil, how much gas is there in Michigan? How much is recoverable? How much might not be as recoverable? People are interested in mineral resources, and we have geologists that work on the mineral resources inventories. How did they get there? What was the earth science behind the formation of these mineral resources? So I'll move on.
Thank you.
Nice and short.
Thank you for inviting me, Marianne, and thank you folks for all coming out today. I'm Christy Klomp. I'm with West Michigan Environmental Action Council. We're known as WEMIAC here in Grand Rapids, and we're an institution, a nonprofit group that has been in place for about 40 years, since the late 1960s, when one of our first goals was to adopt legislation in the state against the use of DDT. And since that time, we've continued to work against things that are damaging to our environment, and our mode of operation has been to help people that are concerned into the positive actions that they can do for themselves and for their communities in order to better the environment. Myself, in my role, I've got a number of projects that I work on. One of them is the Adopt a Stream program. Another program is the LGROW program, which is the Lower Grand River Organization of Watersheds, which is an initiative to coordinate some of the efforts in the West Michigan area to improve water quality in the Grand River. I also work with the Teach for the Watershed program, which is a program where we're bringing science education into the schools here in Grand Rapids and on the west side of the state to teach kids about their watershed and about where their water comes from and about water quality. We also work on community-based projects. Right now we're working on a community-based stormwater project, trying to get citizens involved in ways they can reduce their stormwater usage or reuse the rainwater that they do get on their properties. One of my concerns, probably one of my biggest concerns with water issues, is that we're not living sustainably in the world. The population over the past 40 years has increased something like 3 times, but every 20 years we tend to double our use of water. And at a time where water is becoming scarce, that trend hasn't stopped. In the U.S., we're the biggest water consumers of anyone in the world. We use, per capita, we use 655,000 gallons every year, each one of us. If you include all the consumptive uses, that's not just the amount of water that each of us uses in our homes. It's the amount of water that was used this morning when I took water from my shampoo bottle that was made in Connecticut. It's water that I used this morning with my computer, water that came from Japan in the process of making my computer. It's water that I used from Iowa this morning while I had my toast. So each of us are using about twice as much water as what the average person on the earth is using. And this is something that we've gotten used to. It's my fear is that we aren't valuing water for what it's really worth. And I think some of that starts with us when we're young. I have memories of using water at home when I was a kid growing up much more conservatively than I use water now. When I was a kid, I was one of the youngest kids in a family of 7 children, and we, as I recall, took baths once a week. We had church on Sunday, so you took your bath on Saturday. And being one of the little kids, I got in a bathtub after the other kids had their baths. And to me, now I don't like that idea. I'm not going to get in the bathtub after my older brothers and sisters anymore. But I'm older, wiser, I think. But at the same time, I'm no worse for the wear for having used the same water. Now water is more scarce, and I'm using more water. So this is a problem. And my value for water started when I was young, and I'm afraid that young people today are not getting the same values instilled into them. I don't think enough kids are spending enough time outside to value their natural resources. I think that's where it's got to start. I think that it's not just education, it's somehow instilling the value for what it's worth. At some point we may see a point where we have to put a price on water in a market-based type of approach. And when that happens, I think we're going to start to all value it differently. But if we had to pay for the water that we're using for the value that really is in a scarce time, I think we'll see a difference.
Thank you, Christy.
Well, one of the problems with going last is you end up being redundant. But I do want to thank Mary Ann and Gary and the other panelists. I don't know, it's hard for me to express how fortunate we are here in Michigan to have the resources we do and the people working on water issues, whether it's the folks at USGS like Howard or Christy with WEMIAC. Tremendous resources brought to bear. We're dealing with these issues. We're trying to come up with the best information possible so that we can make the best natural resource decisions. At the Annis Water Resources Institute, where I'm the director, we have about 70 people, full-time and part-time, working on integrating research, education, and outreach to preserve and enhance freshwater resources in this region, in the basin, and across the nation. And I'm proud to be associated with that. As far as me personally and my research interests, I'm not going to get as personal as Christy, so you don't need to know my bathing habits. But in all sincerity, there's a couple issues that I think are very, very important. One, as Christy alluded to, is sustainability. And I've been working on that at a couple of different levels. I'm part of a national committee, a Sustainable Water Resources Roundtable, looking at how we use the water resources across the nation for different economic sectors, energy sectors, the environmental sectors, and what kind of indicators we can form at a national basis to determine whether we're using our water sustainably. And I tried to bring that back here on a statewide level. I've been, for the previous 5 years, I served on the Groundwater Conservation Advisory Council, which Howard's provide technical assistance on that. And one of the roles I played was to develop those indicators and criteria for sustainable use of groundwater in the state of Michigan. And we're also interested in dealing with this on a local level, on a regional level with the International Joint Commission. They have an Upper Great Lakes study right now that's looking at water levels in the Great Lakes, and I'm helping to develop criteria and indicators for sustainable use of water on the basin-wide level. The second area that I think is very important is nutrients, fate and transport of nutrients. Christy alluded to this with stormwater. We have a number of projects that we're working on right now dealing with stormwater, looking at how toxic stormwater is as it runs off of our federal highways into our local creeks. One of the problems we have in our region is land use. As we build more impervious or hardened surfaces, less water is going into our soils, and less water is recharging our aquifers, and more of it is running off through these roads, driveways, parking lots, rooftops, into our storm drains. And there's no leprechaun under that storm drain treating it. It's going directly through into a pipe and into our streams and lakes. And as a consequence, nothing is filtering out those nutrients. So there's a tremendous potential for these toxics, greases, oils, metals, to get into our waterway and affect our biota. So we've got studies going on right now, not only looking at what the potential toxicity is, but how we can put in different best management practices in the watershed, where they should be put in order to get the most bang for their buck, and how much they would cost for different types of BMPs, so elected officials and municipalities can determine how much they can afford in different areas and where they should best target those areas. So hopefully by the end of this project, we'll be able to have a model that local units of government can use in order to determine which BMPs they should use and where they should use them, with a cost-benefit analysis associated with that. Another nutrient-related aspect that I've been looking at the last 5 years is internal loading from lakes. We often focus on the phosphorus coming from external to the watershed, coming through the tributaries, coming in through stormwater, coming in from the atmosphere, but we don't look at it coming out of the sediments. And this represents a historic legacy of phosphorus getting into the lake and being stored, chemically stored in the bottom of the lakes. And when the lakes go anaerobic, in other words, when there's no oxygen present in the middle of the summer, lakes stratify, and the bottom waters can often go without any oxygen at all. The biogeochemistry of the lake changes, and that phosphorus that's normally stored in the bottom becomes available, and it diffuses out of the sediments and into the lake, and that can stimulate algal blooms. And we're getting more and more harmful algal blooms going on in this region. So we've been studying how phosphorus loading from the sediments impacts the proliferation of these cyanobacterial or blue-green algal blooms and the toxicity associated with them. And then finally, one last area that I've been working on that Christy again alluded to is ultimately every environmental problem we deal with boils down to an economic issue. If we don't understand economics, we're not going to be able to solve the environmental issues facing us. And so what we've been doing the last few years is developing an economic valuation tool for ecosystem services in West Michigan. Now, ecosystem services are the services that the ecosystem provides free of charge to benefit humans. It could be carbon being sequestered by plants. It could be the soils filtering nutrients as they percolate through the soil structure before they reach the aquifer. It could be the aesthetics, the spiritual recharge you get when you look out over Lake Michigan. All of those have value, but they don't go through a traditional market. And what we've been trying to do is put a value, a price tag on that. And the bottom line is, in West Michigan, it turns out that it's for the valuation we did for the ecosystem services we looked at was $1.8 billion, that's with a B, dollars per year. And that's a conservative value. The dollar value is less important than the fact that when you go to a planning or zoning official and they see a fallow field along a road, and all they see is a strip mall and tax dollars coming out of that strip mall, my point to them is that there is value there. Regardless of what that value ends up being, don't value it as zero, because that's what they currently do. Recognize that there is an inherent value associated with it, even though it doesn't go through a traditional market. And so it's important that we recognize those values associated with our landscape, with our green infrastructure, with our natural structure out there, before we all turn them into parking lots and strip malls.
Thank you, Alan. As I listened to the presentations to this point and trying to put them all together and see what kind of commonality I see, one of the things that stands out is this whole question of sustainability, mentioned directly by two of our panelists, coming up under Howard's comments about better decisions. I think that what I'd like to ask you to talk about a little bit is how do you relate this general idea of sustainability as a human issue to questions such as how much water do we really have, and how much water do we have to use? And then taking it one step further, how does that fit into this whole question of a footprint? What is the human footprint that we are making in this area around water and around the impact that we are having on the water? And that may not make any sense at all, and if it doesn't, just go ahead and answer something else. So what kind of thoughts do you have around those issues? Anyone, just wide open.
Well, I'll kick it off very briefly and say I think because we are in such a water-rich state, it's very easy for us to be complacent about our use of water here in the state of Michigan. But it is important that we try and be proactive and look ahead so that the water is available, the water that we have today is available for future generations. And that's why I think the state of Michigan is to be applauded for looking forward with its development of the Groundwater Conservation Advisory Council to develop a water withdrawal assessment tool. That's a scientifically validated tool to figure out whether water withdrawal will have an adverse resource impact in the state of Michigan. And I'm sure Howard can talk more about that. But we are really leading the nation in the development of this tool. And I'm very proud of being part of that.
Howard, did you?
I think one of the main issues in that tool is that there's a lot of education that has to be done for people to say all the water that we currently have in the state is being used for something now. The Grand River flowing through the city, we could take half of it out, and that would have some impact. So what we were saying in the council and the development of how this tool would be formed is we have to recognize that anything we do is going to have some impact, and any water in the river or stream is going somewhere. So there's no free water. If I put a well into a field, it's not magic water that just appears from the ground, and there's not a cost to that. That water would have eventually flowed to some stream in most cases, or would have been used by plants or fed another aquifer. So there's some system that's existing now before we impact it, and if we put a well in, we're going to have some impact. And what we try to do with the assessment tool is say, let's figure out how much impact we would think would be acceptable, socially acceptable, so we used biological indicators, fish data, as one criteria, but also panels of people sitting around in Senate working groups and just talking back and forth and saying, well, the fish data suggests you can take, so much water out, but I'd be uncomfortable with a number that's that big. Let's cut that one back a little bit more. This is a real important system. Cold water, small streams, where trout live are attractive for tourism and a lot of other things. So let's protect those more, even if the science says maybe we don't need to protect them as much. They're cold streams. You take a lot of water out, they're still cold streams, and there's still trout living in them. But in the legislative process, they went through and made the restrictions a little bit higher. So there's science and then there's policy, and people need to talk back and forth and realize, and I think it comes out in your book a lot, there's not free water, that we have this huge system so we can take off as much as we want, and that there's no consequence from removing things. And so that's what we try to do in the assessment tool, was quantify that.
Yeah, that's sort of the word on the street in water policy and management in the Great Lakes region is that there is no unused water, as Howard said, in the system already. Every drop of water is being used in the Great Lakes region, either by the ecosystem or by industry or particularly by hydro. All that water eventually makes its way, or almost all of it makes its way outside, out the St. Lawrence River system, where it's used by hydro facilities. So any water that's taken out, say, through the Chicago diversion and heads to the Gulf of Mexico, actually ends up increasing the electrical rates in upstate New York, say, for example, or Ontario, because there's less water flowing through the hydro facilities there and generating electricity. So all the water is being used. And what's interesting to me about the assessment tool here in Michigan is that, historically speaking, Michigan has been the most vociferous champion when it comes to anti-diversion. It has been an enormously huge political issue in the state of Michigan. So Michigan always out there opposing diversions and really, again, being this very vociferous anti-diversion champion in the Great Lakes. But when it has come to domestic water use in the state of Michigan, Michigan has been an embarrassing laggard and has been criticized for years by other states in the Great Lakes region for not doing a very good job of monitoring or regulating its domestic water use, because the idea sort of philosophically in Michigan is, well, we're in the basin, we're entirely within the Great Lakes watershed, and so we can use water in an abundant way. We don't have to worry about it. It's not a diversion because we're not sending it outside the basin or anything else. But let me just give you what I think is one of the most tangible, concrete interstate examples of this. For more than 20 years in the state of Minnesota, if you're going to withdraw water from Lake Superior in an amount that's greater than 10,000 gallons per day, you are required to get a permit. In Michigan, up to, say, 5 years ago, if you were going to withdraw water from Lake Superior, you didn't need a permit for any amount. 5 years ago, you could withdraw whatever you wanted. And then in 2006, Michigan implemented a law where up to 5 million gallons a day, you finally needed to get a permit. And so Minnesota's over here with 10,000 gallons per day, and Michigan's over here at 5 million gallons per day for the same lake, which creates interstate controversy. So this is a domestic water use in the state of Michigan. And so there's been this sort of dichotomy with Michigan's water personality, where the state has really been vociferous about diversions, but been sort of hypocritical with its own domestic water use. Now with this assessment tool, Michigan is leaping to the front, whereby with this assessment tool, Michigan is saying we are going to be paying extraordinary attention to our domestic water use like no state in the Great Lakes region or province in the Great Lakes region, and arguably any state in the country, about not just how much water we're using in a particular area, but by watershed, not by political boundary, but by watershed, which is arguably how water management should be. And so journalistically, what's really exciting to me about this water assessment tool is, number one, it's that Michigan is the state that's pushing it. And you have now these other states around the Great Lakes region are saying, what's going on over in Michigan? Tell me about this assessment tool. And there's going to be a lot of attention in the water community about the assessment tool, how it's used and how it's managed. As I understand it, a business that might want to put a well in a particular watershed can go online and punch in the water withdrawal idea that the business has without having to get any permits or to know whether the business is wasting its own time or the bureaucracy's time or anything else. And if the assessment tool will tell them in advance, don't even bother, or yeah, you do have a chance, or you have a chance, but you might need to lower your amount. This is really forward-looking and progressive. And it's very exciting to see in the Great Lakes region and also in the state of Michigan. So it's fascinating to me. I've been talking to Al about it, and I need to talk to Howard more about it as well, because it's really cutting edge, and it's great to see the Great Lakes region be at the cutting edge of these water policies and water monitoring.
I would say about sustainability of water resources, one of the things we really need to focus on is educating people about water consumption. I would guess that if you asked just about anybody how much water they used, they wouldn't be able to tell you how many gallons a day they used. Even if they received their bill, I'll bet you most of them don't look at it close enough or translate it from cubic feet, if that's what it's in, to determine how much water they're using. The average American uses between 80 and 100 gallons a day just on domestic uses. We're at a time where we're facing water shortages, and around the country, places like Raleigh, North Carolina, who earlier this year was in a situation where water had gotten so scarce they needed to take some steps to reduce consumption. The mayor suggested earlier this year that everybody reduce their domestic consumption to 25 gallons a day. I don't know about you folks, that would curtail my usage a lot. I wouldn't be able to use. I'd have to go back to taking baths again with family members. That's not very much. I use probably twice that much in my home on a domestic basis. And I'll bet, and I probably use less than most people that I know. I think it's one of these things we need to look at how to get this word out to people. One of the things that's been suggested is some sort of labeling on products to indicate how much water was used, per item to manufacture something. Something happened to me a couple years ago. I was out of the country for almost a year, and when I came back and came into our grocery stores, everything was labeled, 0 carbohydrates. And I missed something that year. Somehow carbohydrates weren't good anymore, and so you wanted 0. And I didn't catch that message along the way. When I saw 0 carbohydrates everywhere, I thought, 0 carbohydrates means 0 satisfaction to me because I'm hungry. And so I didn't buy into it. But we need to do something similar, I think, with our labeling and pricing and education to the public, to let them know that water is used in everything that you eat. You could have the beef labeled with how much water was used, to produce this pound of ground beef, as opposed to the chicken. Even if that wasn't enough to persuade people to buy differently, it would be at least enough to make them realize that this is something we need to start concerning ourselves with.
Let's maybe try to tackle one more before we let the audience have at us. Have at you. I'm just the monitor. My question was triggered by Peter's comment at the beginning when he mentioned climate change and water issues. My ears perked up right away. One question obviously is whether or not we're going to end up with water wars. But I'm thinking, what about climate wars and water wars? So how do we see climate in relationship to water? A lot of times people talk about, well, there are the water experts and there are the air experts, and never the twain shall meet. But I think that the indication, what you were suggesting, is that we can't think of these things separately. And so what we're really talking about is systems. And so how do we get our minds around the complexity of the relationship between air and water and anything else you want to throw in there, and still at the same time keep people engaged in trying to solve the problems?
Yeah, well, I think this is going to be arguably the biggest environmental public policy issue of the century, is how societies around the world deal with climate change and the big unknowns. And we have scientific studies and modeling that's been done that's really can be inaccessible to the general public, because climate modeling and assessments and predictions, or they don't call them predictions, I guess, but that's how the public interprets them, can be really hard to understand and what it all means. And the public has a hard time understanding that science is the latest information that we have interpreted for the general public, but then when new information comes in, then scientists change their analyses. And so that in the newsroom, for example, if you have an editor who's not got a science background, he says, well, if we don't know absolutely what it is, why are we writing about it? Well, scientists never know, in some cases, absolutely what it is. It's just the latest research that points in a certain direction. And this is certainly the case with climate change. As the modeling and the research becomes more sophisticated, then we have more concrete information about where we're headed. But as I'm told, as a journalist interviewing scientists, is that the more you zero in regionally, the more difficult it is to sort of suggest where the environment will be going as far as climate change impacts are concerned. So they can give you a big picture more easily on how much global climate and temperatures are going to change, say, but what's going to happen as you zero in, say, on the North American Southwest, and what the precipitation patterns are going to be, or precipitation patterns and evaporation or evapotranspiration patterns in the Great Lakes region. What that's going to be smaller in smaller areas is much more difficult to predict. But I have yet to hear about any particular region on any of these studies that's going to be so great under climate change. I don't hear about any climate change winners. I just hear a lot about climate change losers. And so sort of kick that to the scientists up here. Are there any climate change winners out there that I haven't heard about? And if so, what are they, and how are they winners?
Well, and that's a really interesting way of putting it, Peter. Certainly, as Peter alluded, as you get what's called downscaling, you have these general circulation models that are looking at things at a very global basis, and then you downscale to particular regions. And there are different ways of downscaling this, and there's tremendous uncertainty at the finer and finer scale you get at. Currently, southeast United States is supposed to actually get a little wetter over time. In the Great Lakes region, the predictions are all over the board, but there seems to be some general consensus that we're going to stay about the same or maybe get a little wetter overall, but the precipitation we get is going to be coming in fewer and more intense storms. So the implications for that are quite profound, because our infrastructure handling the stormwater will not be sufficient anymore to deal with those very intense storms with a lot of flow. So we're going to have more, potentially we're going to have more sewage overflows, what the EPA euphemistically calls blending, into our rivers. And clearly there's going to be more pathogens getting into our waterways. We may have more beach closings, which could have economic implications. So, I mean, again, this all ties in how these environmental scientific issues translate into economic and social issues, and we have to figure out what the policy is. One of the things I always tell my students is from the vast majority of problems that we face, the vast majority of environmental problems, we have technical solutions. What we don't have often is the political will, the economic, financial incentives to make them happen, and the willingness of us, humans, to change our behavior. That is often where the stumbling block is.
Other comments?
I'll just add one, and I'll have to take off my survey hat for just a second. But I think that one thing that this points to, the complexity of climate change, but also other scientific issues, is that we may have to start breaking down how we've been doing science for the last 400 years, of breaking things into nice. I'm a groundwater scientist. I study groundwater, and just having my refining it into simpler and simpler problems that I can solve with a model, or that I can take data for, because there's all interacted with what Al was just saying about how it interacts with society, how it interacts with policy, and we have to start taking these more systems approaches and complex approaches and looking at the whole system, because if it warms up slightly in Michigan, we might have a few more growing days, so then we could double crop, and then maybe we need more irrigation. But then there's more irrigation, so there's more demand on the water system. So even though we might be getting more water overall in a climate change scenario, we're using more because irrigation is a big consumptive use. But then we're producing a lot more food, and food is important. And so then there are societal questions about, well, when do you draw the line? When should we say you can't irrigate anymore, or you can't produce more food? So if we try to break everything down into, Al comes to me and says run a groundwater model, and I say, well, here are the results, and then you take that to your group and say, well, here's what the groundwater is going to do, but my model never considered that you're going to change your behavior. So there's all that feedback somehow needs to be built in. So I think we need to build these institutions and these ways of looking at things that build in that feedback in those different scales of things happen at different spatial scales, things happen at different time scales. So I'm really interested in how that's going to happen, and I don't have the answer, but I just think that a lot of these questions are multi-layered, and we tend to look at things from our own specialty, and then expect that the policymakers will be able to take all these specialties and come up with the right answer. And sometimes I think we criticize policymakers and politicians, and some of it's unfair that these are complex things, and we expect them to listen to me because I'm of course I'm right.
I really don't have a lot to add to that. I'd like to be optimistic about it and hope that if we do have climate change, that it goes a little warmer here in Michigan for some of us. Maybe we'll have more tourism because of that. Of course, then there'll be more demands on our water. I think there's enough uncertainties as far as what's going to happen with climate change that I don't know how useful it is to make all these predictions. I think we need to be careful in a lot of the tools that we're creating today, that they're flexible enough to account for changes that we may see, because again, we don't know how quickly some of these changes could occur either. So
I was encouraged to hear the comment about getting out of our boxes and out of our specialties and thinking about the bigger picture, because I agree that I think that's one of our crucial questions, is how are we going to put everything together and not rely on somebody else to figure out what is going to happen here. I'm sorry I stopped being moderator for a minute here. But I appreciate that comment. I think that's a valuable comment. I'm sure that many of you have multiple complex questions to ask our panel that you've been itching for the opportunity to ask. So why don't we do this? If you would, when you ask your question, would you stand up? And if you want a particular person on the panel to answer the question, direct it to them, or if it's just a general question, just open it up to whoever wants to respond. Go ahead. I saw a hand over here.
It seems like instead of diverting Great Lakes water, that we would make desalination plants in the southeast, southwest Gulf. Why aren't we doing any of those things as a nation, as opposed to
There actually are desal plants in Santa Barbara and Tampa right now that are going online. The problem is they're incredibly expensive. So energetically, the economics don't work in their favor. Now, it could be in the future, as Christy alluded to at the very beginning, when the economics of water really reflect the true cost, which we don't pay the true cost of water right now, that those desal plants will be economically more effective. But at this point, the economics work against it, and that's why you don't see them more often.
Other responses to the question?
Just to add to that, a lot of the expense comes from energy costs, and so if we can figure out the sustainable energy picture, then that could reduce the costs of desalination and thereby have sort of a two-step impact as far as the sustainability of water use is concerned. But you're absolutely right. We've got huge population centers right on the edge of these oceans, and there are desal plants operating in Florida and California. I think there's more than one in California. And there's a weird desal plant in Arizona that's involved with the Colorado River that we won't have time to get into here. There are a lot of desalination plants in areas of the world where energy is cheap, like the Persian Gulf, and fresh water is scarce. So there's a lot of desalination plants, and Israel has some high-tech desalination plants, but that's kind of a national security issue for Israel as well. So,
and of course, the ones in the Persian Gulf have a lot of oil to help.
So they have a lot of energy that's at a low cost. So and water scarcity drives up the value of water. So economically speaking, in the Persian Gulf, desalination doesn't seem as expensive because they need the fresh water and they have this abundance of oil. So.
There's also an environmental cost to desalination, too, that it produces a lot of salt that then needs to be disposed of. And in some places, that has ended up being a real problem where they've tried to desalinize water. So else to consider.
Like we could use salt, like we use coal at birth. Every problem you have is a solution.
Yeah, I don't know about burning salt.
How about over on this side? Yes, sir.
I was just wondering, when you're talking about the model for the Great Lakes, and if evaporation is part of that puzzle, and is that obviously there's billions of gallons that's taken up in the atmosphere and that goes to other states in the form of rainwater, what have you. How do you put a price on that? Or is it our water that's going up into the air and going to Canada or to the East Coast? I'm curious about that.
I'll let the scientist answer that one.
If we're talking about the same tool that I've seen, the model they're talking about, it's based on using the low flow of groundwater in streams. Is this the one we're talking about?
I think we're talking about the water withdrawal assessment tool, which really doesn't get at that.
Right, it doesn't really have it in there explicitly.
But
the evaporation is really actually very interesting because it's evaporation and rainfall on the lakes that really is a big driver of lake levels. There's so much water in the lakes and there's so much flow through the system that our use doesn't affect levels that much. But a dry year with a lot of evaporation, or a warm winter when the ice doesn't fully cover the lake and shut off wintertime evaporation will really affect the lake level. So I don't know where that's going, other than evaporation's an interesting question, and it is a major driver of water off, but then precipitation back on the lakes is the major source of water to the basin.
As part of this International Joint Commission's water level study that's ongoing right now, evaporation is one of the areas that is really being honed in on because we have such uncertainty in those numbers, and it's such a potentially big player. Incredibly, up till now, until very recently, we had no direct measurements of evaporation in the Great Lakes. It was all based on models, and there was tremendous uncertainty associated with these models, plus or minus 20%. And so just in the last year, an evaporation station has been placed in Lake Superior to take direct measurements, and hopefully we'll be able to parameterize those models much better, get a much better handle on how much evaporation is occurring. A lot of people don't realize that the greatest amount of evaporation occurs in the early winter. It doesn't occur in the summer, but it's when we have the cold air mass coming out from Canada over still the relatively warm water, like right now, is when we lose most of our water due to evaporation.
How about, yes, the gentleman in the yellow shirt.
I have kind of a question about our roles in this situation as to our water consumption. I know there was a lot of interesting talk about, Christy, considering your computer that was made in Japan with water power and labeling food as to how much water was used in its production. And I'm just curious, do you, anyone on the board, do you think that our time would be better spent with those kind of efforts, or with just educating the everyday person to turn off the shower 30 seconds early, to go to a commercial car wash rather than doing it in the driveway and having all that runoff, maybe fewer dish loads and things like that? Would our time be better spent actually saving the water in our personal lives, or in concerning ourselves with amounts of water that we're using in products that we're using personally? I just honestly don't know. I can't imagine that my iMac is taking 500 gallons of water from Japan and bringing it into my ecosystem, because I'm assuming that a lot of it stays there and gets reprocessed. And what's going to be the best use of our time and our effort to do our part to conserve water?
Question.
Yeah, that's a good question. Domestic water use is actually one of the smallest uses of water that we, globally that we use. Agriculture probably produces the most, or uses the most. So, when it comes to just getting the word out there about turning the water off while you're brushing your teeth, those are all good things and things that we can each do individually. But if we're going to really turn things around, we need to look at every aspect of water use, and it's not that using my computer is wasteful of water in itself. It's that everything that we do has some impact on water, or has impacted water somewhere along the line, either in the production of the product. The water wasn't necessarily transferred out of a basin in some of those cases, but it's still something that we need to educate ourselves. And it can be, we can put a quantification on each one of those uses, and a lot of those already have had numbers put to them, so that you can determine, how much impact you're having on the environment by eating this food or using this product. I think, in order to get everyone to conserve water, it's going to take, a number of different approaches. Not just, getting the message out with a brochure, but it's going to take a lot of different approaches.
Other comments, responses? How about other questions? How about right here in the front?
I just have a question. I know we're trying to stop water from being diverted, like from letting companies divert water to other countries or to use it, to clean their products. But shouldn't we be concerned too with the amount of pollution that we're allowing these companies to drop into Lake Michigan or Lake Superior? Because if we had keeping all this water in the basin, it's kind of be pointless at some point, because it's going to be so dirty and we can't really reuse that. So what are your takes on that?
It's an interesting question. If you saw Peter's lecture last night, you realized that the really gross amount of pollution that we used to have that came out of points, the point source pollution that came out of pipes, has been taken care of to a large degree. 40 years ago, before the Federal Clean Water Act was passed, 70% of the pollution in this country came out of these point sources, out of these pipes, discrete conveyances. With the passing of the Clean Water Act, now 70% of our pollution comes from non-point sources, off of our farms, off of our lawns. We're creating it, and it's much more diffuse. It's more insidious because it's harder to see and it's harder to regulate. So when we talk about cleaning up the Great Lakes, we need to look at ourselves, not just at industries, not just at companies. Not to say that there are certainly bad players in all sectors of society, but we need to look in the mirror as well.
Yeah, if I could just add to that, I mean, it is important to realize that as hard as it might be to sort of seem to be for us, that the amount of industrial pollution these point sources from the pipes from these companies has dramatically been reduced in the last generation or two, and the Clean Water Act really did work in that regard. But what's been interesting is that so you had this period where you had all this pollution in the lakes, and people turned away from the lakes because they stunk, and particularly Lake Erie was a horrible place to visit, and fish died and washed up on the shoreline and that kind of thing. And then the Clean Water Act cleaned up the lakes, and people have turned back to the lakes now. And they're paying closer attention to the Great Lakes. Citizens, just average people, are paying closer attention to the Great Lakes than they have in a long, long time. And what you're seeing is more questions like this one and less tolerance, even for understandable point source pollution. There was a case with BP, and they had a refinery in northwestern Indiana, and they had talked about increasing, and they had permission from the state of Indiana, increasing their pollution discharges into Lake Michigan. And their BP's sort of, I'm oversimplifying here, but their thinking was they're processing a more difficult kind of oil from the Canadian tar sands, and it was an understandable from their perspective increase in the discharge. It became enormously controversial, particularly in the Chicago metropolitan area, in the Chicago media, and the Chicago congressional delegation, because there was like this zero tolerance among the general public for any increases in pollution in the Great Lakes, period. No matter what the industrial side said about how reasonable or understandable it was or anything else, we don't want to hear, the public was saying, any more about increases in pollution. We always want to hear about decreases in pollution. And it sort of reverberated through the Great Lakes industrial community, and sort of like, wow, a wake-up call. And I think we're in this new generation now where people are paying more and more attention, and there's going to be a higher bar for industry. And industry has a real challenge now to explain these policies to the general public and rationalize them, because they just sort of a zero tolerance kind of perspective among the general public that we're going to hear more and more about.
How about over on this side, in the front row?
I think the panel's done a great job of pointing out that water is a finite element, something that we should value and conserve. And, we're from the Great Lakes states, and water to us as we grew up it's there. It's always available. It's in large amounts. My question, I don't know if there's an answer to it, but is what is it going to take to change the mindset for people to start conserving and using less water and looking at the value of every product that we consume? I mean, when gas went to $4 a gallon, that was a trigger, and we all started conserving. I mean, it came out of our pockets. What kind of event do you think it would take in the Great Lakes area to get people to really realize the value of our water and start conserving along some of the ideas that we've heard today?
I think that's going to be difficult in the Great Lakes because we're so blessed with water around us. I like to use a scenario, though, that one of the problems we have here is we've got this, it's almost a tragedy of the commons. As long as my water gets flushed down into the same place as yours, and, then, why should I bother being the one that's conserving? I think in order to see conservation, people need to actually see the value of it. If we don't have a water shortage here in Michigan, it's going to be more difficult than other places around the U.S. where people are starting to see it, where they're actually starting to get, it's coming out of their pocketbook to have, to use more water. People will start, considering whether they're going to water their lawn. If the price of water goes up that high, then that's one of the things they're going to cut back on. I like to use a scenario that if each one of us is allocated a certain amount of water, you can demonstrate how much it is. An area or a volume, something like 16 feet this way, 15 feet this way, and 12 feet this way is the amount each one of us gets to have each year. That's if we consider all the water in the world. That's how much if mine is separated from yours, I can guarantee you that I am not going to be using any of that fresh, clean water to flush my toilet. So it's one of those things. It's a good question. I'm not sure either what it's going to take to get everyone to value it. But until we somehow reduce this tragedy of the commons, concept that everybody has and actually values water for, what a great resource and necessary resource it is, it's going to be difficult.
In the back.
Gathering just everything that's said with the assessment plan, with putting a value on property that with a basic property where it's zero based on where water comes from, where water different basis of where we get our water. Is it not feasible to put an economic value on the water to almost how everyone's worried about economy right now? And I know this is more of a broad picture, putting a general price on water to regulate water diversion, making more of an economic value in the eyes of the people, and therefore being able to regulate how much is used. And although I think I see the problem being there is who would own the water in that situation. And this is kind of just a general, what are your opinions on that?
It's an interesting question, and it's one that's receiving more and more attention these days. And there's a diversity of opinion on this. And I think you were talking about it at the end. There are some people who are very afraid of going down that road because they don't want to commodify water. They feel like it's part of the common trust. And therefore, once you start putting a price tag on it, then it starts going through a market, and it goes through a process that they're very fearful of it'll be lost from that public trust. On the other side are the utilities, who very much right now when we pay for water, we're not paying for the value of H2O. We're paying for the price it costs to process it and transport it to our spigots. And so they would like to see that price increased because that could be going into improving our infrastructure, which is desperately needed. I mean, currently the EPA has identified our funding gap for improving our water infrastructure, both sewage and drinking water. It's something like $400 billion a year. Is our gap. We're not even coming close to closing that. So we need to find ways to do this. We have infrastructure. We are in Detroit. We are moving drinking water in wooden pipes that were built, 150 years ago. I mean, just unbelievable. And this is one of the things I also like to mention. If you could see our sewage traveling through the pipes, if it was above ground instead of underground, people would be paying money without thought in order to improve our infrastructure. But we can't see it leaking. We don't see that sewage dripping into our aquifers because it's out of sight, and therefore it's out of mind. And there's a cost associated. There's an economic cost. There's an environmental cost. These are the kinds of things. These are the social policy and economic policy issues that we tend to ignore. And as Howard and Peter and Christy have all alluded to, we need to think of these in multidimensional terms. Otherwise, we're not going to solve the problem.
Every summer, Grand Haven reports that there's too much E. coli in the water to go swimming. What do you think is the problem? Why do we get E. coli just in the summer when we want to swim?
We only measure it in the summer. I mean, that's the reality. My guess is that it would be there year-round if we did the measurements, but the state requires us to do beach monitoring during the summer months.
It wouldn't be there year-round, I can guarantee you.
Well, I would disagree with you, but respectfully disagree with you.
What you're not figuring into the factor is that there's 6,000 migrant workers, apple pickers, whatever, blueberries, without bathroom facilities. So they're going into the streams. And by the time from early April to the end of July, August, it takes that long to get down there. And then when they leave the end of October, the flow stops. So if you went and read it now, it wouldn't be done. It would be very low.
Actually, as part of our research profiles, this is not part of what the state mandated monitoring is. We have been monitoring a few select beaches, and we do find E. coli for a couple of different reasons. And I appreciate the fact that the source for migrant workers is an important one. It's very seasonal. But there's a couple of other things to consider. The city of Grand Rapids has done a marvelous job in cleaning up its overflows, its combined sewer overflows. Right. But the city of Jackson and Lansing continue to have tremendous amount of sewer overflows in their cities, contributing to the Grand River and ultimately down there. But more and more scientific studies are showing that a lot of the E. coli is coming from waterfowl feces that get into the sand, and inside the sand it's able to stay viable. And once that sand is resuspended, the E. coli is getting up in the water column, and that's going to be year-round. So what we need to do is track the source of where this E. coli and bacterial coliforms are coming from. Is it human, coming from migrants or from wastewater management systems that overflow, or is it coming from our waterfowl as a totally different source that we can't control nearly as well for obvious reasons, and partition those sources, because we don't want to spend money, limited resources, going after a problem that we can't solve.
We have time for one more question here, maybe. How about in the back?
I believe this question is mostly for Ms. I think that's Klon. Considering that our state is bankrupt and we have, we're talking about this plan to protect the water, is there an idea in place as to where we get funding? Because it doesn't seem like we can raise taxes and our state's bankrupt, so we kind of need to bring businesses and people who have money around. Is there an idea for where funding would come from for like a public education campaign or anything like that?
I don't have an idea for funding, but a public education, we're working on that, and it's one of our initiatives at WEMEAC is to educate the public. And we try to do things with as little money as possible. And we need to be conservative about our water usage. So, one of our first things that we want to educate the public with is to capture that rainwater. If it's something if you can put a rain barrel outside your building, you can capture water that can be reused for a lot of things that you don't need to have water that's been treated, through a municipal system. Or additionally, putting, structures in that will funnel rainwater back into the groundwater system. Those are all things that we can do without a lot of money. We're working at it. We're working at it without a lot of money, but if you've got an idea for money, we'd like your ideas too.
Well, if you have additional questions, I'm sure the panelists would be glad to entertain them individually. But I think we're going to call it to a halt right now. Could we maybe thank the panel for all their hard work today? And thank you all for coming.